Tonight, we begin with an ultimatum that has alarmed U.S. diplomats, warned of by NATO strategists, and been quietly prepared for by intelligence agencies. This ultimatum, delivered not through months of secret negotiations, but in a single publication, eliminated the last vestiges of diplomatic restraint. A single publication explicitly referring to Russia's nuclear doctrine. A single publication insisting on Ukraine's complete surrender or facing what Moscow describes as irreversible consequences. What Vladimir Putin accomplished today breached a threshold that Western leadership had hoped would remain intact. And when that threshold was crossed, the U.S. did not hesitate. It responded swiftly. Although there have been no official statements or diplomatic correspondence to date, there were signs that the Kremlin was planning something unprecedented. Putin has certainly been hostile, but methodical in his hostility. His maneuvers have maintained a certain rhythm, a degree of predictability, almost a regular pattern. But what has caused concern in Washington and Brussels during this period is the disappearance of this rhythm. The sudden relocation of mobile launch platforms, encrypted communication between strategic command facilities, the activation of early warning radar networks, the unexpected withdrawal of diplomatic personnel. All of this has vanished as if it were nothing. And whenever Putin disappears, it means he's going to do something that will make noise. Earlier this morning, U.S. intelligence detected what they describe as unprecedented nuclear signaling operations, including the repositioning of platforms capable of carrying tactical warheads that had been stationary for more than 18 months. These represent categories of assets that Russia only activates when it wants to communicate something exceptionally special. We can call it escalating tension, coercion, or preparation. Western intelligence couldn't determine which category it belonged to, or if it encompassed all three. But what they understood for certain was that Moscow had shifted its strategic position. And when a nuclear-armed country shifts its position without explanation, even a minor change, the Pentagon focuses intensely. Putin made a statement. Hours later, he demanded that Ukraine withdraw from the territories Russia claims to have annexed. He demanded that NATO halt all arms deliveries and issued a stern warning that any breach would be met with all the means at Russia's disposal. This terminology was universally interpreted to include nuclear alternatives. Washington's response was swift. Officials in briefings characterized Putin's action as irresponsible, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, a fundamental misinterpretation of Western resolve. But ultimatums only work if the recipient hesitates. Ukraine did not hesitate, and neither did the United States. In fact, America's response today is among the most significant military aid announcements we've witnessed since the start of the conflict. Here's what we understand. 6 hours after Putin's broadcast, the Pentagon announced an allocation of $2.3 billion in emergency security assistance. These weren't typical ammunition resupply or armored vehicle shipments. These were advanced long-range attack platforms and weapons that the United States authorizes only when positioned to fundamentally alter a battlefield. Pentagon officials reported that the United States is accelerating the deployment of long-range ATACMS missiles, additional Patriot air defense batteries, and components necessary for F-16 fighter jet operations. These components include ammunition that analysts believe was restricted in an effort to prevent escalation. Washington acted before Moscow could exert any psychological pressure. They authorized attacks that penetrated deeper into Russian-occupied territory. They approved targeting logistical centers supplying Russian forces on the front lines. They approved platforms capable of reaching command facilities that were presumably coordinating the ultimatum's military foundation. In other words, the United States targeted Russia's capacity to execute its threats. The infrastructure that would have rendered Putin's ultimatum operational, this is what rendered Washington's response so immediate. Putin's ultimatum was not merely symbolic. It was executable. It represented the variety of coercion that could reconfigure European security if left unaddressed. And the United States, comprehending that, completely responded with force, not recklessly. not impulsively, but strategically. They did not escalate to parallel Russia's rhetoric. They did not participate in nuclear posturing of their own. They struck the conventional capabilities that rendered the ultimatum believable. They reinforced Ukraine's ability to defend and counterattack. And here's where the narrative becomes considerably more significant. Intelligence officials presently believe that Putin's ultimatum was engineered to evaluate the solidarity of Western support following months of political ambiguity in Washington. Putin wanted to observe whether the United States would split under pressure, but the opposite happened. They responded so quickly and comprehensively that even the Kremlin acknowledged it. You can't effortlessly grab Moscow's attention. That's impossible. But today, Washington achieved exactly that. Defense analysts who spoke to Reuters on condition of anonymity described Putin's approach as coercive diplomacy, a mechanism for extracting concessions through intimidation rather than negotiation. But Ukraine and its partners demonstrated today that they are both united and capable. Their response was not only instantaneous, but also meticulously tailored to address every key threat vector that Putin raised. This precision is important because it demonstrates intelligence preparedness. It shows that Washington didn't react to Moscow. It anticipated Moscow. As reports continued to come in throughout the evening, it allowed us to learn more about the scale of America's response. The Pentagon, after urgent consultations with NATO partners, issued a unified statement within hours. European allies targeted weaknesses in Ukraine's air defenses that had emerged over the previous 30 days. Intelligence agencies operating across Eastern Europe reportedly increased their surveillance of Russia's nuclear-capable forces by 300%. This was not just military aid, of course, nor was it just a diplomatic message. This was a reinforcement, a strategic reinforcement. This was operational deterrence. And deterrence is the only element Putin has been trying to undermine since February 20. We all know this. With every escalation by Russia, the West has responded with something that increases the cost of further aggression. Remember, Putin believed the West would exhaust itself supporting Ukraine. He believed Europe's energy dependence would shatter NATO solidarity. He believed American political divisions would paralyze decision-making processes. But tonight, the opposite is happening. NATO is more consolidated than it has been since the Cold War. European countries are increasing their military contributions instead of reducing them. And the United States has announced its largest emergency aid allocation in over a year. What makes this moment so dangerous and revealing is that Putin's ultimatum comes at a time when he is facing increasing domestic pressure. Hardliners are demanding faster territorial gains. Economic advisors want sanctions lifted. Security services are demanding internal stability. Nationalist voices want visible victories. Putin is trying to balance these demands while managing a conflict that has cost Russia over 350,000 casualties. And when leaders in this position make sudden maneuvers, they are acting not from strength, but from pressure and fragility. The State Department statement circulating globally through diplomatic channels is designed to convey that Washington is not prepared to allow nuclear provocation to succeed. Officials have made it clear to us that Russia's ultimatum is incompatible with responsible nuclear state behavior. In diplomatic terminology, this means this is unacceptable and will have consequences. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a measured, defiant speech to his nation this evening. He said they would not negotiate under the shadow of nuclear blackmail. He stated that every ultimatum from Moscow only strengthens their resolve. And he said history will remember who fought for freedom and who surrendered to fear. Are these mere rhetorical embellishments? These are the statements of a nation that understands how high the stakes have risen. What makes the situation even more worrying is that Putin's ultimatum was not isolated. Alongside his nuclear rhetoric, Belarus announced joint military exercises on Ukraine's northern border. Iran confirmed the delivery of additional Shahed drone components. North Korea reportedly accelerated shipments of artillery ammunition to Russian ports. All this happened within the same 72-hour period. When Moscow moves multiple components simultaneously, it means something bigger is developing. Analysts are presently considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major spring offensive. Another is that Putin is attempting to freeze the conflict on current territorial line. A third possibility, the one concerning officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish nuclear threats as a legitimate negotiating instrument. But today, Washington removed that card from the table. They did not wait for European consents. They did not condition their response on Russian de-escalation. They did not offer Putin an off-ramp at Ukraine's expense. They reinforced Ukraine's ability to fight and to prevail. What we are observing now is a test of resolve. Putin seeks to determine whether nuclear threats can divide the Western alliance. Ukraine seeks to demonstrate that sovereignty cannot be negotiated away. Washington seeks to prevent nuclear coercion from becoming normalized, and Europe seeks to prevent this conflict from expanding beyond Ukraine's borders. Tonight, we have heard from NATO officials who are presently monitoring Russian nuclear forces continuously. They state there is no indication of imminent nuclear use. They state Putin's rhetoric exceeds his apparent operational preparations, and they state Russia's decision to issue this ultimatum is likely component of a broader pressure campaign intended to influence Western political calendar. But Ukraine is not retreating. In reality, Ukraine is intensifying operations in multiple sectors. The response today, rapid, targeted, and unapologetic, communicated to Putin that threats will not produce concessions. And it communicated a message to Washington that their support is generating a measurable difference. As the days ahead develop, we anticipate more details to surface about what precisely Putin hoped to accomplish. But what we understand is that America's response was timely. It reinforced Ukrainian morale at a critical juncture. It demonstrated Western unity under pressure, and it elevated the cost of future Russian escalation. What transpires next will depend on what Putin executes in the next 72 hours. If he de-escalates, this moment will be remembered as the ultimatum that backfired. If Putin goes any further, Washington and its allies have already shown they are prepared for a prolonged conflict. They have shown they are ready to retaliate. Tonight, Vladimir Putin internalized something he has internalized many times before. Nuclear threats don't divide democracies. They unite them. Ultimatums don't weaken resolve. They strengthen it. And underestimating the West remains his greatest strategic mistake. But let's look at what this moment actually reveals about the broader architecture of this conflict. Because what happened today wasn't just about military equipment or diplomatic statements. What happened today revealed the fundamental tension that has defined this war from the beginning. Russia believed it could shatter Western unity through escalation. The West believed it could deter Russian aggression through solidarity. And tonight, we saw which theory prevailed under pressure. Consider the timing. Putin delivered this ultimatum at a time when the West was arguably most vulnerable. American political discourse was fragmented. European energy markets were tense. Ukrainian forces faced difficulties on multiple fronts. From Moscow's point of view, this should have been the ideal moment to apply maximum pressure. But what Putin miscalculated, and still miscalculates, is that democracies don't collapse under pressure as authoritarian systems predict. They adapt, they readjust. And when existentially threatened, they unite in ways that autocrats fundamentally misunderstand. The speed of Washington's response tonight was no accident. It was the product of months of contingency planning. Intelligence officials were considering precisely these kinds of scenarios. What if Putin issues a nuclear ultimatum? What if he demands territorial concessions under the threat of escalating tensions? What if he attempts to use weapons of mass destruction as a diplomatic bargaining chip? These scenarios were analyzed, debated, and prepared for. And when the moment arrived, the United States was not caught unprepared. They were prepared. This preparation is important because it demonstrates something Putin consistently underestimates. Western democracies may appear chaotic, divided, and slow-moving. However, when fundamental security interests are threatened, they possess an institutional depth and strategic consistency that authoritarian regimes cannot emulate. Russia makes its decisions through a small circle of advisors around a single man. The United States, on the other hand, makes its decisions through a complex interagency process involving military commanders, intelligence analysts, diplomatic strategists, and political leadership. This process may seem cumbersome, but it produces comprehensive, coordinated, and resilient responses. Tonight's announcement was not just a Pentagon decision. It was a government-wide response reflecting input from the State Department, the National Security Council, the intelligence community, and key congressional leaders. This kind of coordination requires preparation. It requires institutional capacity. And it requires a level of strategic subtlety that Russia, despite all its military might, has struggled to match throughout this conflict. Now let's talk about what happens next, because the next 72 to 96 hours will be absolutely critical. Putin has issued an ultimatum from which he will not easily back down. He has tied his credibility both domestically and internationally to this moment. If Ukraine does not surrender, if the West does not crumble, he will face a choice. It could escalate further, which would be extremely dangerous, or it could continue its current operations while adjusting its rhetoric, which would amount to an implicit admission of failure. Or it could try to find some kind of reputation-saving mechanism that would allow it to retreat from this position without appearing defeated. Each of these options carries significant risks. Further escalation would almost certainly lead to additional reactions from the West. At least that's how it seems. NATO has made it clear that any use of weapons of mass destruction would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict. The alliance hasn't specified exactly what this response would encompass, but the ambiguity itself is intended to be a deterrent. Putin knows very well that crossing this line would lead to consequences he cannot fully foresee. Softening the rhetoric while continuing current operations would signal weakness to domestic public opinion, which is what Putin needs to satisfy Russian military bloggers, nationalist commentators, and hardline political figures are demanding visible victories. If Putin issues an ultimatum and then backs down when it's ignored, these voices will become even louder and more critical. And finding a way out that preserves his reputation requires a willing partner. But Ukraine has made it clear it will not negotiate under nuclear pressure. This is putting Putin in an increasingly constrained position. The tools Russia has relied on throughout this conflict, military pressure, energy coercion, nuclear threats, are yielding increasingly less effective results. Each escalation elicits a Western response that makes the next escalation more costly. Every unanswered threat erodes the credibility of future threats. Every month Ukraine continues to fight demonstrates that Russia cannot achieve its goals solely through force. What we are witnessing is not just a military conflict. We are witnessing a fundamental test of whether coercion can succeed against a united democratic alliance. And tonight, that test yielded a clear result. The alliance resisted. Ukraine stood firm, and the United States demonstrated that nuclear blackmail cannot dictate policy. But let's not confuse clarity with simplicity. The situation remains extremely dangerous. Putin is a leader under pressure, managing a war that hasn't gone as he calculated, facing domestic voters demanding results, and confronting a Western alliance that has proven more resilient than he anticipated. Leaders in this position don't always make rational calculations. Sometimes they cling even more tightly to failed strategies. Sometimes they escalate tensions in the hope of achieving a breakthrough. And sometimes they take risks that outside observers would find irrational. That's why the next few days are crucial. We will be watching the signals from Moscow. Are they repositioning their forces in ways that signify preparation for large-scale offensive operations? Are they adjusting their nuclear posture in ways that signify actual readiness for use rather than just signal? Are they engaging in diplomatic contacts in the background in ways that indicate a search for avenues? We will also be watching NATO. Are the European allies maintaining their forces, or are there signs of a breakdown? Are debates emerging about how much support they will give Ukraine in the face of nuclear threats? Are there voices calling for compromise or concessions? And we will also be watching Ukraine. How are Ukrainian forces responding on the battlefield? Are they launching operations demonstrating their capabilities by utilizing new weapon systems? Are they maintaining their morale despite the nuclear rhetoric? Are they showing the kind of resilience that has defined their resistance throughout this conflict? Tonight, all these indicators show determination. NATO is united. Ukraine is determined. The United States has demonstrated its readiness to back up its commitments with concrete actions. But this decision must be upheld, and this resolve must be sustained. It must be strengthened through sustained support, sustained coordination, and sustained transparency about what is at stake. Because what is at stake is not just Ukraine's sovereignty. What is at stake is whether nuclear-armed states can use weapons of mass destruction as a diplomatic tool. What is at stake is whether democracies will stand firm when threatened. What is at stake is the entire international security architecture that has prevented conflict between great powers since Putin's ultimatum tonight was not just about territory in eastern Ukraine. It was about testing whether this architecture is still valid. And the answer tonight from Washington, from Brussels, from Kyiv was clear. The architecture is valid, the commitments continue, and nuclear coercion will not succeed. This war is not over yet. But one thing is very clear tonight. Ukraine is still fighting. America is still committed. And Putin's ultimatum has already failed. And as the next stage unfolds, we will be following every detail. Stay tuned to stay informed about the development.